in this country. We are proud of our diversity. We need to amend the Citizenship Act in order to ensure that groups that were previously excluded now be treated fairly. We also need to address the constitutional issue that has been ruled on by the courts. We need to look at the case of people who are Canadian by descent and born abroad. According to the Superior Court, the limit imposed by Mr. Harper was unconstitutional.
Yes, a conservative piece of legislation that was deemed by the courts to be unconstitutional. Comme l'a dit la honorable ministre, pour comprendre
As the minister said, in order to understand the scope of the problem, we need to understand the history of the Citizenship Act.
We know that this cohort is a limited one. The majority of lost Canadian cases were remedied by the legislative amendments that were implemented in 2009 and 2015, with approximately 20,000 people acquiring citizenship or having their citizenship restored through these amendments. It's comprised of a specific cohort that meets specific criteria. This cohort of lost Canadians was born abroad between 1977 and 1981 in the second or further generation and already turned 28 and lost their citizenship prior to the passing of the 2009 legislation and repeal of this age requirement. Madame la Présidente, when I was first elected, I had a couple from southern Italy come visit my office who now reside here in Canada, and this situation applied specifically to them. Their mother was a Canadian citizen born in Italy who had obtained Canadian citizenship through her father. The wife was born in Italy. The mother could not pass down the Canadian citizenship to her daughter because of the legislative changes brought in by the prior Conservative government. Again, cleaning up conservative messes still 9 years forward. This cohort of lost Canadians was again born abroad between 1977 and 1981 and had already turned 28 and lost their citizenship prior to the passing of the 2009 legislation and repeal of the age requirement. The goal of Senate Public Bill S-245, brought forward by Senator Martin from British Columbia, as well as the amendments adopted by the members of the Standing Committee on Citizenship and Immigration, was to restore the citizenship of these lost Canadians affected by the age 28 rule. When Bill S-245 was studied by the Standing Committee on Citizenship and Immigration, the bill as amended aimed not only to restore citizenship to this group, but also to allow some people born in the second or further generations to be deemed Canadian citizens by descent. Their citizenship status hinged on the condition that their Canadian parent could demonstrate a substantial connection to Canada. In other words, if that Canadian parent had been in Canada for 3 years before the child was born, consecutively or otherwise, their citizenship can be passed on to that child, even beyond the first generation abroad. Bill S-245, as amended by committee members, also proposed to ensure that children born abroad and adopted by a Canadian beyond the first generation can also access citizenship. In those cases, there's a different process for adopted children, but the end result remains the same. They're Canadian. The Ontario Superior Court decision that deemed the Harper Conservative first-generation limit on citizenship by descent unconstitutional came down after the committee began its review of S-245. Given that the first-generation limit is a key element of our citizenship by descent framework, Parliament must establish a new framework to manage the issues raised by the court and ensure fairness in Canada's Citizenship Act. Yes, fairness, something like the opposition party does not really understand. S-245 has now gone through a number of changes and improvements based on feedback from experts and those directly impacted. Therefore, we have included and adopted some of the committee's suggested changes in C-71 to ensure the needs of Canadians are accurately reflected. C-71, an act to amend the Citizenship Act 2024, will restore citizenship to the remaining lost Canadians and their descendants, doing the right thing, doing what's right for all Canadians. A Canadian is a Canadian is a Canadian. Similar to the proposals in S-245, this bill expands access to citizenship by descent with a more broad approach, a focus on inclusivity. These revisions address the issues raised by the Ontario Supreme Court of Justice regarding the previous Harper Conservative legislative amendments, including the first-generation limit. Conformément aux modifications apportées.
Therefore, with these amendments to the Citizenship Act, we will help these lost Canadians. This bill will automatically confer citizenship on certain individuals born abroad who were not able to receive citizenship for various reasons. There are also cases of dual citizenship. There are also countries where if you are a citizen of another country, this can create legal problems and can lead to being stripped of certain benefits. With people in that situation, the bill proposes giving them access to a simplified renunciation process. The same one as previously. And so, therefore, people will need to make a renunciation request. These amendments to the Citizenship Act will ensure that all children born abroad to Canadian parents from before the bill was adopted will become Canadian citizens. And the amendments will also ensure that children born abroad in future to Canadian parents born abroad will also receive citizenship at birth. If their Canadian parent has a substantial connection to Canada. And I hope that thanks to the support of all parties, this bill will move forward quickly and effectively.
We are talking about Bill C-71, but more importantly, we're talking about Canadian citizenship and what it means and how to obtain Canadian citizenship. I know, in speaking to the residents of Vaughan Woodbridge this summer and really every weekend at events and stuff, we have our issues and challenges in Canada. Yes, we do. But one thing I know I live in one of the best cities in Canada, if not the best. And I know I live in a beautiful province called of Ontario. And I know Canada is the best country in the world. It is. I know it will be. We have a bright future ahead of us. And this fact of being able to attain Canadian citizenship, much like my honourable member from Kingston, the Island said, my parents got selected to come to Canada as immigrants in the late 1950s and 1960s. They won the lottery. I often joke around, it'd be nice to win the lottery, but I won the lottery because my parents were chosen to come to this beautiful country where I now reside, my brothers, my family all over, actually, Canada, and where my wife and I are raising our 3 children, 2 of them who play competitive soccer, and we spend a lot of time driving around, and a little one in daycare still. And you know what? They won the jackpot that their grandparents on both sides got chosen to come to Canada and are now Canadian citizens. That is a place we're here for. That is a country, it's the best country in the world. Anybody that says otherwise is just being condescending and trying to do for political gain, and it's really such a shame. Thank you, Madame la Presidente. I look forward to questions and comments. I'm really happy to be back here to do the good work that we were elected to do as members of Parliament, all 338 of us, because we're here for one thing, to make the best country in the world even better. Thank you, Madame la Presidente.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Edmonton Manning.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Besides ballooning the size of the Immigration Department with negative result and making a mess out of the department itself, what will the Honourable Member propose? How much stress Bill C-71 is going to leave on the department in addition to the stress that they're in right now?
Member for Vaughan Woodbridge.
It's nice to see the Honourable Member from Edmonton Manning, who I know himself is, via his family, are newcomers to Canada as well for many years, and has 2 wonderful sons that have bright futures in this country that I know have a great education and are working and are doing very well. That's what Canada is about, so let's give it a thumbs up. In terms of the Immigration Department, we know the hardworking people at IRCC are processing millions and millions of visas, millions of applications, because, do you know why, Madame la Presidente? because people want to move to this country. People love this country. They know that this country, despite the challenges that we face and globally, is the best country in the world to come to establish a family. Yes, we've gone through some hard times. We've gone through global inflation. We went through COVID. There are wars that we have not seen for 80 years happening in the world. But you know what? I never bet against Canada. The official opposition may. I will never do that. Canada is the best country in the world. Madame la Présidente.
Commentaire, l'honorable député de Montcalm.
The honourable member for Montcalm. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I've been listening to my Conservative colleagues' questions since earlier. And it seems like he wants to use the time we have here to make it into a debate about all of the problems having to do with immigration management, whereas here we are actually debating a simple case of injustice. And the Conservatives seem to be opposing a motion that would make this go through very quickly. But instead, they refuse because instead they want to go into all of the immigration system in detail. Of course, we in our party also criticize the management of the immigration system. We've asked questions about it at question period, but why get things mixed up like this? Why not focus on the substantive aspects of this bill?
I thank my colleague for the question, for what he said. We are here to do good work for our constituents, those who are working very hard.
Good work of Canadians, wherever they live in this country. This injustice with lost Canadians was caused by a Conservative government under Mr. Harper, where he put in measures that were deemed unconstitutional, whether it was for immigration, for justice measures, and so forth. That's what happened. They go to the courts. They don't like the courts. Madame la Présidente, they do not like the court system. They view the judges at all. I hear some heckling on the other side. Again, decorum.
If honourable members have questions and comments, they should wait till the appropriate time. The honourable member Vaughan Woodbridge, if you could wrap it up so I can ask another question.
The honourable member from the Bloc Québécois, who represents one of the ridings in the province of Quebec, we need to fix this injustice for Canadians across this country. What has happened is wrong. We know it. Canadians born abroad to a Canadian citizen are Canadians. They should have always been treated as such. Yes, there are measures here for substantial test that's made that is fair and right. I thank you for your time, Madame la Présidente, and great to see many of my colleagues.
Questions and comments. The honourable from Edmonton Strathcona.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and I would like to thank my colleague for his intervention in the House this afternoon. I think we all can agree that this is very, very late in coming. I know the incredible work that my colleague from Vancouver East has done on this file to push the government to do this, to call out the government for why this has taken so long. But I do have a specific question for the member. The commencement provision of Bill C-71 confers discretion on the Governor and Council, so the Cabinet, to determine when the Act will come into force. It does not specifically specify the timeline or a deadline for when this needs to happen. I wonder if the member could talk a little bit about the intention of the government, and can we be certain that this government will bring this forward and will bring this into effect upon royal assent?
The honourable member for Vaughan Woodbridge, a brief answer.
I thank the honourable member from Edmonton Strathcona for their intervention and their question. We need to bring this piece of legislation forward. We need to get it passed with all party support. The Conservatives should know this is the right thing to do to correct an injustice. I agree with the honourable member. We need to get this royal assent and moved into force as soon as possible to ensure there are no injustices to Canadians, specifically in regards to their citizenship. Being a Canadian, we're very proud to be Canadian. These folks are Canadian, and they're just as proud and to get that citizenship that we are fortunate and blessed to have today. Thank you, Madame la Présidente.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Edmonton Manning.
Thank you again, Madam Speaker, for giving me the opportunity several times today. I will be sharing my time with the honourable member of Mission, Mascue, Fraser Canyon. Madam Speaker, like many members of this House and millions of other Canadians, I was born in another country. Canada is very much a nation of immigrants, and I'm proud to be one of them. I came to this country as a young man, leaving behind a civil war which had been raging for many of my life. I came here seeking peace, stability, and opportunity. I will admit, I did not know that much about Canada before moving here. It didn't seem necessary to learn more about what I already knew, that Canada is a cold country with warm people, a place where newcomers are readily accepted regardless of national origin, race, color, or creed. What more did I need to know? I was welcomed here with open arms. It didn't take long for me to realize that Canada was a place I would be proud to call home. I found a job, got married, started a family, and realized that's just how much this country means to me. I knew I wanted to be part of it. That's my future, and my family's future was here. I became a Canadian citizen in 1994. I started a business, got involved in community organizations, and eventually was asked of by the people of Edmonton Manion if I would represent them in this House. It has been an honor and a privilege to serve my country in this way. One of the delights of being a member of Parliament is that I have been able to hear so many stories from my fellow Canadians, especially their life, they're like myself, came to this country to make it home. I have heard hundreds of times how people came to this country and why they chose Canada. Pledging allegiance to this nation is a serious business. In becoming a Canadian, you are saying that you want to be part of the greatest family in the world. Like marriage, becoming a citizen is a serious commitment. It isn't something that should be entered into lightly for convenience sake. As Canadians, we are all very aware of our rights. We even have Charter of Rights and Freedoms. What we don't talk often about is our responsibilities as citizens. It isn't only about what Canada can do for us, it's also about what we will do for Canada. Being a Canadian should mean something more than having a passport accepted everywhere in the world. Being a Canadian is a state of mind, of a joining together of different people for a common cause. Because I know what it means to be a Canadian, I cannot support Bill C-71, an act to amend the Citizenship Act 2024. To me, this legislation devalues the idea of citizenship. It is as if the Liberals want to grant citizenship to tourists. I can see the advertising slogan now, quote, "Come spend your summers in Canada, and after 10 years, you will be in citizenship as added bonus," end quote. Why are those who wish to become Canadian citizens no longer expected to live here and become part of our country, of our society? Where is the commitment on their part to become part of the community? Does being Canadians not matter anymore? In 2006, the Canadian government spent $94 million evacuating 15,000 Canadians from a conflict in Lebanon. It's my home country. Many of those were people who had the benefit of Canadian citizenship, with minimal connection to Canada. Once things died down, they went right back to the country that they thought as their first home. They were Canadians of convenience. That's why the Harper government amended the Citizenship Act to restrict the transmission of Canadian citizenship to only one generation born outside of Canada. It does not seem right to me, or to the most of the Canadians, that citizenship should be granted to generations of people with no ties to Canada. Perhaps it's time to tighten our citizenship rule, not weaken them. We don't need more Canadians of convenience, people who hold Canadian citizenship but live abroad and do not participate in Canadian society. This legislation is intended to address concerns raised by Ontario Superior Court that ruled that the first-generation cutoff rule in the Citizenship Act was unconstitutional. Bill 71 is hastily written, ill-conceived proposal that needs a lot of work before being acceptable to Canadians. Instead, Instead of fixing the problem, the bill weakened the rules under this act to pass on citizenship to children born abroad. The bill introduces a substantial connection test where parents must demonstrate they were physically present in Canada for 1,095 days or cumulative days at any point in their lives. This rule applies to those who are Canadian-born, neutralized Canadians, and those born abroad. I don't know what you think of as substantive, but 1,000 or so cumulative days don't seem to me to be much of connection to Canada. If you live elsewhere but spend summer vacations in Canada, it wouldn't take that long to reach the required number of days. I can see that this could be a part of a new tourist industry. Maybe I'm biased, but I think that experiencing a couple of Edmonton winters should be a requirement for anyone wishing to become a Canadian citizen. After all, one of the things that binds us together as Canadians is the shared experience of cold weather. Certainly, if this bill isn't amended, it will increase the stress on the civil service. Somehow, someone will have to be tasking on checking that the citizenship applicant really has spent 1,095 cumulative days in Canada. What burden of proof will that be required? When I became a Canadian, I did so that I was going to give my all to this country. I understood that Canadian citizenship was a privilege, not a right, and that it was something offered to those who understood what it meant to be Canadian, who accepted Canadian values, who wanted to work together with other Canadians to make our society even greater. Canada is not my backup plan. Canada is not my backup plan. It is my only plan. Exactly. And I know how important Canadian citizenship is. I don't see that important reflected in Bill C-71. Madam Speaker, both the Liberal and the NDP wants to play game. It's all of a sudden, after they made such mess, after the immigration rules and laws in Canada, they're getting another chapter of making a bigger mess out of the department by adding more stress to a failing department and failing immigration system. Bill C-71 does not respond to that. It adds to the disaster. I will not vote for it. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments, questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Vaughan Woodbridge.
Thank you, Madame la Présidente, and to the honourable member from Edmonton, Manning. We know Bill C-71 is the right thing to do. We know Bill C-71 is correcting an injustice that was caused from the prior Harper government, where the courts ruled the law that was in place at the time unconstitutional. The Ontario Superior Court of Justice ruled unconstitutional. This is the right thing to do to correct an injustice. It's about fairness. I have much respect for the honourable member from Edmonton, Manning. I just want to ask the honourable member, through you, Chair, why would you not support a piece of legislation that corrects an injustice? Thank you, Madame la Présidente.
For Edmonton, Manning.
Madam Speaker, I already listed many points why I don't support C-71, and to that, I'm not interested in a political game with the Liberal and the NDP. That's why there's many other Canadians the government need to speak to. Go and hit the road, talk to people, knock on doors, and the first thing comes out of Canadians, how disaster the immigration system has become in Canada and why need to have a fix, not an additional disaster adding to it.
Questions and comments, the Honourable Member for Repentigny. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'll pick up on the comment from my colleague from the Conservative Party saying that the immigration system in Canada, there are a lot of holes, there are a lot of things that aren't working. We totally agree on that. But C-71, well, they're not talking about the immigration system as a whole. That's not what we're talking about. It seeks to correct an injustice. It says that women are especially affected, that people who work for the government internationally are especially affected, and that is what C-71 seeks to address. The Conservatives are blocking things. They did it at the Senate. They did it when it came to adopting C-71 immediately. Is the real reason the Conservatives are against it that it had been a law that was brought in under the Stephen Harper Conservative government?
Honourable Member for Edmonton Manning.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm surprised also by the Bloc Québécois. I'm not sure what's in it for them on C-71. There's really, as I said, the bill is ill-conceived and the bill is badly written, and there's no evidence to support their argument. Therefore, I'm so surprised. I'll throw the question back at them why they'll be supporting this bill.
Questions and comments? The Honourable for Edmonton Strathcona.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And I would like to thank my colleague from Edmonton. You know, I have to say, though, his speech was deeply disappointing. I was in his riding quite a lot this summer. I spoke to a number of his constituents, a number of people who put him in this position. They are absolutely appalled by his failure to speak up for Lebanese Canadians, for Palestinian Canadians on the genocide happening in Gaza. But more importantly, when he stands in this place and talks about Canadians of convenience, does he feel he's the one who gets to choose who is a Canadian and who is not?
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Manning.
Well, I deal with my community and I've got my backing of my community. I don't need the NDP to go and knock on my doors to tell me what they do. They better spend their time elsewhere. That's on one thing. The other thing is, Madam Speaker, I'm not the one who's trying to impose anything on Canadians. If anybody's doing that, it's the Liberal and the NDP throughout the last 2 years of making a disaster out of the immigration law in Canada. So they better be ashamed and they better be knowing what to ask people before they even suggest so.
Time for a brief question. The Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The Honourable Member for Edmonton Manning says he wants Canadians who believe in Canadian values, and certainly one of those is the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is why the courts ruled that the cutoff rule for second-generation Canadians was unconstitutional. My question to the Honourable Member is, for Canadians of convenience, how does he imagine that they so cleverly plan ahead to choose their parents so that they can then claim Canadian citizenship?
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Manning has 1 minute to respond.
Well, I think that's a much bigger question, and thanks to the Honourable Leader of the NDP for this question. It's a much bigger problem she's raising right now. And again, there's nothing that I suggested in my speech that reflect on anything other than the allegiance to Canada is the right thing to do. And to be Canadian is to live as Canadians live, and to feel what Canadian feels, and to be close to, and to be back in this country of every way, not to have the convenience of just having the passport to travel anywhere in the world. That is the argument. It's a valid argument, and many Canadians will respond to that in a positive way, as I'm suggesting today.
So before I go to resuming debate, I just want to remind members, because there's been members on both sides of the House that seem to want to interject when someone else has the floor. I would just ask them to please wait till the appropriate time to either ask questions or make comments. Resuming debate, reprise de débat, the Honourable Member Mission Matsky Fraser Canyon.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Bill C-71 before us today seeks to amend the Citizenship Act to do three things. First, it would ensure that children not born in Canada but adopted by Canadian parents would be treated as Canadian-born citizens for the purposes of passing on citizenship if they have children abroad in the future. This is something I support. Secondly, it would restore citizenship for individuals who lost it due to non-application for retention or rejections under the former Citizenship Act, Section 8. Again, this is something I support. Thirdly, and most importantly, it would abolish the first-generation limit for Canadian citizenship by descent established in 2009 and replace it with a substantial connection requirement, which would allow a foreign-born Canadian citizen to pass down their citizenship to their children and grandchildren born abroad, so long as they have spent at least 1,095 days in Canada cumulatively. It is this portion of the bill that I have concerns with that I will outline here today. The first issue relates to the hot-button issue in British Columbia for many years of birth tourism. Birth tourism has long been an issue in Canada, and this bill leaves the door open to the practice continuing long into the future. In fact, it would encourage it. For those that don't know, birth tourism is the practice of traveling to another country for the purpose of giving birth there. This is generally done to obtain citizenship for the child, taking advantage of our birthright citizenship laws. In Canada, there are 3 pathways to citizenship. The first is known as jus sanguinis, or right of blood, in other words, being born to a Canadian parent. The second is naturalization, the process of immigrating, obtaining permanent residency, and eventually citizenship, as my previous colleague alluded to. The third is jus soli, or right of soil, in other words, being born on Canadian soil. A 2023 article in the National Post discussed jus soli, highlighting how a single hospital in Richmond, BC had 502 non-resident births in 2019. Across Canada, 4,400 non-resident births took place in 2019, more than triple the number in 2010. In 2023, the first baby born in Vancouver was born to a birth tourist. The mother even told local reporters she had made her first ever trip to Canada specifically to secure a Canadian passport for her daughter. A 2020 CBC article titled All About the Money, How Women Traveling to Canada to Give Birth Could Strain the Healthcare System highlighted that Canada is in a small minority of fewer than 36 countries who grant citizenship based on birthplace, regardless of parents' nationality or status. It noted that a high concentration of non-resident patients giving birth in Canada has led to compromised care for local mothers-to-be and nursing staff. Another article in 2023 noted that while air travel restrictions during the pandemic slowed down the trend, numbers have started to increase again right now. It highlighted that of 102 non-resident women who were surveyed after giving birth in Canada between July 2019 and November 2020, 77% cited birthright citizenship as their primary reason for giving birth in Canada. It is very clear that this pathway to citizenship is being abused, and this program will only see the numbers increase as the Liberals reduce security checks for visitor visas as well. Therefore, thousands of children each year are born in Canada and leave with the full rights and privileges granted to any other Canadian. And should they choose to come back to Canada at any time in the future, they will have access to Canada's healthcare and generous social security benefits without the requirement to pay any taxes before they arrive. Right now, Canadians are paying more taxes while getting less. How is it fair to Canadian taxpayers? Even Liberals have recognized that this is a big issue and called for change. In 2018, the former Liberal MP for Steveston Richmond East, Joe Pescalito, tabled petition E1527, which called on the government to address birth tourism, citing its exploitation of Canada's generous public health care and social security system and violation of Canada's sense of fairness. I would be remiss if I didn't note that when the first generation limit was brought in 2019, Liberals even voted in favor of it at third reading in the House of Commons. How is it just that a birth tourism baby will be able to pass on citizenship to their grandchildren under this proposed law? That is the big question today. Citizenship will be passed on to the grandchildren of Canadians born here solely for the purposes of obtaining citizenship.
For my constituents, that is not just. The second issue I have to raise in respect to this bill are the obvious ramifications of eliminating the first-generation limit, namely the capacity of Immigration, Refugee and Citizenship Canada to meet its current obligations on top of the additional files
this law will inevitably create if it is passed. Earlier today, in the minister's remarks and from questions from the member from Calgary Shepherd, the minister was not able to respond to the number of people that will be impacted by this law. That is irresponsible. This proposed legislation could lead to tens of thousands of additional files to process, leading to even more backlogs in our strained immigration department. In the Ontario Superior Court ruling that led to the legislation proposed here today, the court cited a 50% error rate even among the samples that were cited during the court proceedings. We already have seen the effects of an overcrowded immigration system. In fact, we're living them today. Checks are being missed, and dangerous people have been allowed into our country due to a lack of due diligence and effectiveness by our officials. Just over a year ago, Harjeet Singh Nijjar was murdered outside of Gurdwara in Surrey. It was revealed that his alleged murderers were in Canada on student visas. In just the last months, the RCMP have foiled multiple terror plots by people who had recently come to Canada. In the spring, RCMP officers foiled a plot by a 62-year-old Canadian citizen who had been filmed taking part in a beheading on behalf of ISIS in 2015, which was not found before he was granted citizenship. Then over the summer, we learned of the arrest of a 20-year-old Pakistani citizen who obtained residency in Canada, who was planning to commit a massive attack in New York around the anniversary of Hamas's barbaric attack on Israel on October 7th. His plan was to kill as many Jews as possible. With IRCC already failing to ensure dangerous people are not granted visas, PR, or citizenship, how can we trust that they will be able to effectively track the 3-year significant connection clause for potentially tens of thousands of new applicants on top of our already overburdened system? Additionally, this bill does not require individuals granted citizenship to undergo criminal background checks, posing even more security risks and undermining Canada's standards for who can become a Canadian citizen. The third issue I'd like to raise today relates to the Supreme Court. It relates to the Supreme Court and the lower court in Ontario. When it comes to something as important as the granting of Canadian citizenship, I believe this decision should have gone to the Supreme Court of Canada and not a provincial court judge in Ontario. If I had more time today, I would also raise points on the financial implications of this bill and the effects it could have on Canadians, on our democracy and voters abroad in future elections. And finally, on the financial implications as well, the government has not been able to provide any estimates in respect to the costs that this bill will have on Canadians. As was referenced in this House already multiple times today, the former Conservative government brought forward a first-generation limit in response to the crisis in Lebanon in 2006. That cost Canadian taxpayers over $94 million. And as my colleague from Edmonton outlined, many of those people left Canada after they used our consular services and generous supports that Canada used to protect them. The question before us today is, do we really want to create a new wave of Canadians of convenience? In closing, I do not believe that that is a good idea to extend citizenship to the second generation born abroad for the reasons I've been able to briefly outline. Thank you for your time, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments, questions et commentaires. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary of the Government House Leader.
Yes, Madam Speaker, I'm wondering if the member can expand upon his thoughts in regards to the Superior Court in the province of Ontario with the decision. The Conservatives have taken the approach that they would have appealed that decision. Would the Conservatives have agreed if the higher court would have reinforced that particular ruling, or would they have potentially, given their opposition to it, used the notwithstanding clause?
Well, thank you,
the Honourable Member for Mission Matsky Fraser Canyon.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you to my colleague from Winnipeg for the question. The fact of the matter is that I believe our citizenship is sacred. It is something that all of us, especially in this room, have a responsibility to uphold and to dignify. And I believe that the questions a question of such importance, namely who is able to be granted Canadian citizenship, should not be determined by an Ontario Supreme Court judge. I believe it would have been in the interest of Canada and the Government of Canada to appeal that decision to higher courts, so ultimately the Supreme Court of Canada could have made a decision on jus soli and its implications moving forward. That said, I will not answer a hypothetical question about what the Supreme Court could or could not have done. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
And comments, l'honorable député de Montcalm.
The honourable member from Montcalm. Thank you, Madam Speaker. My colleague's speech fits into what I was saying earlier. It speaks about many things without answering the main question. An example, a Quebec couple goes to work abroad for the Quebec province. They have a child, they come back. This child lives in Quebec and therefore is Canadian. This child, as an adult, goes to work abroad. They have a child, but that child would not have Canadian citizenship. That doesn't make sense. Does he not agree?
The honourable member for Mission Mansky Fraser Canyon.
Right now, the Bloc Québécois have a serious determination to make. Do they stand with the Liberals in centralizing more power in Ottawa and removing the powers of citizenship under Quebec's rules? I do not believe that the 1,095 cumulative days is a good test for determining citizenship. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments, questions et commentaires. The honourable for Kamloops, Thompson, Caribou.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's always a pleasure to rise on behalf of the people from Kamloops, Thompson, Caribou. And something that's come up frequently is talking about this court case. And what I understand is that it's a lower court decision. And what really interests me is that the Liberals talk about this decision and how, well, why should it have been appealed? And I will remind the Liberals here that there was a decision of a year or two ago from a court of appeal that they didn't like because it was about oil and gas. And that very day, the Prime Minister marched in here and said, we will be appealing. Why? Because it fit his narrative. I wonder what this member has to say when the Liberals seem to talk out of both sides of their mouth about whether things should be appealed or not appealed like this.
The honourable member for Mission Mansky Fraser Canyon.
Madam Speaker, I will admit I am not an expert on constitutional law like my colleague from Kamloops, but I do know, like every other Canadian, that intuitively our citizenship is something that is sacred. It is something that needs to be upheld, and that a lower court decision should not be the determining factor on a matter of such importance as determining our citizenship. I will note again that the Liberals on February 15th, 2008, voted to eliminate the second generation provision that is being debated here today. And I think the Liberals back then made a right decision, and I call upon the Liberals to listen to their constituents and uphold the citizenship law as it is today in respect to the first generation limit. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, the Government House Leader.
So thank you, Madam Speaker. And, you know, it's interesting. I've had the opportunity on a couple of occasions to ask Conservatives in regards to their actual position with respect to the notwithstanding clause. And I think at the end of the day, Canadians need to be very much aware that the Conservative Party has demonstrated that they really don't have a problem resourcing the notwithstanding clause if the need is there. Now, if you start listening to what the Conservatives are actually saying about this particular piece of legislation, take a look in terms of what they've done with regards to a so-called Conservative Senate bill that was brought in, or a Conservative-friendly Senate bill. One begins to believe that they are diametrically opposed to what this legislation is doing. And I think we all need to be concerned about that. Because at the end of the day, they, through legislation and manners in which they vote, they start to show their cards, whether they like it or not. People will start to get a sense in terms of what it is that the Conservative Party stands for. We know that the Conservative Party does not have reservations for not using the notwithstanding clause. I asked the question directly to the member, is, well, it's hypothetical, I'm not going to answer that question. Well, I think it kind of pushed it to the side, or maybe a little too quickly. because I do think it is a very important point. You know, when you talk about citizenships, and you talk about first generation, the second generation, and what it is that was actually done back then, you have to put it in the perspective of Canadians and what it is that Canadians do abroad. I had the honor of serving in the Canadian Forces for a number of years, for a few years, I should say, and through that process, you get to know a lot of people, whether it was veterans from the past to, at that time, current members. And a lot of members of the force actually spend a great deal of time outside of Canada. And while they're outside of Canada, they will often have a child. That child might ultimately come back to Canada for a relatively short period of time, maybe posting, it could be education, that they're having to leave Canada again. And they find themselves in that situation in which the Conservative Party has made the decision that they're not, that child of that serving member doesn't necessarily deserve the right to ultimately have his or her children get recognized for Canadian citizenship, depending on the situation. The same principles.
Point of order, the honourable member for Mission Matsky Fraser Canyon.
This is not debate. The citizenship law, as the member is referring to, it doesn't apply to Canadian Forces members.
To elaborate on the honourable member's speech and on policy, and he can do that during debate. The honourable member for parliamentary secretary. Oh, sorry, I got another point of order. The honourable member Timmins James Spade.
Madam Speaker, I want to congratulate you, but I'm very concerned that the member is trying to undermine legitimate questions that are being asked of his rather ridiculous speech.
Order. I just, again, want to remind members that if they want to contribute to the discussion, they should wait till the questions and comments, that these are not points of order. There are more points of debate. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, the Government House Leader.
Yes, Madam Speaker, mine is as a part of the actual debate, my comments. And I can tell, you know, the member that stands up on a point of order calling into question my statement in regards to legitimate concerns that people have in regards to that second generation and beyond. There are many Canadians that have all sorts of reasons and rationale that is used that might put them into a position where the law that was passed back in 2009 by Stephen Harper ultimately has compromised them. And at the end of the day, Madam Speaker, what's being lost in a lot of the discussion, especially coming from the Conservative Party, is that this legislation will have a very profound, positive impact for many people that believe, as they should, that they are Canadians, Madam Speaker. And the Conservative Party of Canada is saying no to that. Now, they will come up with a rationale or an excuse as to why, or to attempt to justify their attitudes in regards to it, Madam Speaker. But I would suggest to you that there is a fundamental flaw to their thinking. And that is the fact that the law that was passed by Stephen Harper and the Conservative Party back in 2009 has a fundamental flaw to it. It's called the Constitution. The Constitution of Canada and Charter of Rights clearly demonstrates through a superior court in the province of Ontario that the law, as was passed by Stephen Harper and the Conservatives, was in violation of the Constitution. And that was done, and that decision was made back in 2023. In November, it was towards the end of 2023, Madam Speaker. Now, if you were to rewind a little bit, you will find that there was a wonderful opportunity to be able to address the issue in the form of a Senate piece of legislation that was brought forward dealing with the issue of citizenship. The Conservative Party at the time saw the merit of the legislation to the degree in which they were prepared to bring it through the legislature, through the House of Commons. on behalf of the Senate. Well, Madam Speaker, things are going relatively well until it gets to the committee stage. Now, I wasn't at the committee, but what I'm told is that there is hours and hours and hours, 30 plus, maybe it's 29 plus, I'm not 100% sure of that, but anyway, many, many hours where the Conservatives actually filibustered the debate. Why? Because the Conservative Party felt that the opposition and the government members were changing the legislation that made it unacceptable, Madam Speaker. Even though you had a superior court in the province of Ontario say that it was in violation of the Charter of Rights, or the Constitution. So now it passes committee stage, Madam Speaker, and what happens? Well, because it was a Conservative initiative, that means the Conservative Party has to allow it to come for debate for report stage and third reading here on the House of Commons. Well, we all know that there's a calendar that's set, and that calendar, Madam Speaker, allows for private members' business, in particular, I'm talking about S-245, to ultimately be guaranteed virtually because it was high enough in precedence to actually get that debate, Madam Speaker. Now, the Conservative Party has made the decision that they don't want that debate because Madam Speaker, when that debate starts, it's only like 2 hours. That includes that report stage. So, the brain thrust from the Conservative Party, that House leadership team that believes in things like using the notwithstanding clause to take away rights, Madam Speaker, well, they feel we don't want to bring it forward, so what we'll do is we will defer it to another piece of legislation. I don't know how many times they've done that, Madam Speaker, but that's what they've done. So now it leaves the government in a very difficult position because that Superior Court decision actually allows us to make the changes, and I believe it's to the end, could be the end of this year, Madam Speaker. Don't quote me on it, but I believe it's to the end of the year. And at the end of the day, Madam Speaker, we need to see the legislation ultimately get through. Because if it doesn't get through, then it causes some other issues. I'm actually encouraged that the NDP member has stood in her place and tried through unanimous support to try to get it through the House. And it's not the first time. When we had the agreement between the Liberals and the NDP, it was an attempt to get it through virtually all steps, and I thought that was a good idea, Madam Speaker. Now we're saying let's at the very least get it to the committee. In fact, some Conservatives will tell you, well, you know what, it just needs some amendments. Maybe we could support it if we get some amendments to it. The problem is, Madam Speaker, that the Conservative Party knows, I know right offhand, the only way this legislation is going to get to committee based on the discussions that I've witnessed and the history of the Conservative Party playing a destructive force here on the floor of the House of Commons, the only way it is going to get out of second reading and going into committee stage is if the Bloc or the New Democrats decide to support a government initiative to time allocate the legislation. If that does not happen, Madam Speaker, I don't believe for a moment that the Conservatives are going to allow it to go to committee. Because they have made the determination already that this is bad legislation. That's the reason why I used the example, so that people that are following the debate have a better appreciation in terms of why it's so important that the legislation actually pass. Because we are talking about real people not being able to be recognized and being given their Canadian citizenship, Madam Speaker. That is a very real issue. When this legislation passes and receives royal assent, there are going to be people that are going to be given their Canadian citizenship, Madam Speaker. We all know how important that is to Canadians. When you think of citizenship, it's been pointed out, there's 3 ways in which one becomes a citizen of Canada. the easiest and most obvious way is